Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today for this conversation with Professor John Lennox about the word that's on everyone's lips, coronavirus, and a question that goes along with it: where is God in all of this? Now, Professor Lennox has just written a book on the subject, God and the Coronavirus, and of course that is what we're here to discuss. John, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. What motivated you to write this book, and how long did it take?
Well, when the coronavirus broke, as a mathematician, I know a little about statistics, and I sensed from the very start that we would rapidly see an exponential increase, that is, a doubling every few days or every week or so on. And I thought this is going to be utterly unique and devastating. And I thought, look, I'm locked down. I need to think about how to speak into this situation. So the book actually took about a week to write, but I was working 8 to 12 hours a day on it.
One of the central chapters, naturally, is how can there be a loving God if there is coronavirus? And we know that that is a version of a question that everybody recognizes. How can there be a loving God presiding over our suffering? Is this a clue that he really doesn't exist? Now, I realize there's no quick answer to that question, and indeed books have been written about it. So perhaps I'd ask a less expansive question, but getting at the same idea. Where do we look for hope in the present situation? What's your view on that?
Well, the reactions to something like the coronavirus are very mixed around the world. So you get atheist and theistic reactions and pantheistic reactions. And I probe these things by heading straight for, first of all, the atheist solution strikes me as not really a solution.
By that you mean this is evidence that there is no God, so we've got what we've got and put up with it.
Well, that's exactly right. But what I would like to say about that is that it's a very strange way from my perspective to go, because in the hard atheist view, like that of Dawkins, there is no good and there is no evil. So atheism actually removes the very concept of good and evil. So there's no point in calling this kind of thing natural evil, this disaster, if there's no such thing as evil. But the second thing is, and it zooms in on your mention of the word hope, one thing that atheism does remove is any possible hope. Now, as a Christian, I have a huge question, and this is the hardest problem I face. The two problems, really. One is moral evil, the bad things people do to others, and the next is coronavirus type, tsunami type, earthquake type, which is what we often call natural evil, where fractured nature seems to devastate humanity. Now, if you say that there is no God, then you've removed all possible hope. And people, as you rightly ask, are looking for hope. And I think there is hope to be found, not in any simplistic way, but the Christian message comes in here. And to go to the very heart of it rapidly, it talks to us, however incredible it may seem at the moment, about a God who knows about suffering. And if we take seriously the notion that Jesus Christ was God's Son, then there we have at the heart of Christianity God on a cross, putting it crudely. So we ask the question, what is God doing there? And that's the beginning of hope to me, because it tells me that God has not remained distant from our human suffering, but he himself has become part of it. Now, that's only a beginning.
Without doubt, there are many people, Christian leaders among them, who have a real heart to say something meaningful to people. And quite often we quote scripture and so on. And I wonder if you would agree that there's a real challenge here in not sounding cliched and even, dare I say it, insincere, just repeating words. I mean, how can we give counsel in a way that is sincere, heartfelt, and actually speaks to the real needs of people?
That seems to me to be one of the most important pastoral questions that COVID-19 raises. And what I find helpful is to see the way in which Jesus himself treated people in a tragedy. And the story that immediately comes to mind is the story of Lazarus and his two sisters, Martha and Mary. Lazarus was allowed to die. The sisters sent a message to Jesus saying he was very ill. And instead of coming immediately, he stayed where he was. But eventually he came to Bethany, where the sisters were. Now, this was a tragedy in their family. And there are tragedies in many families through coronavirus, through loved ones dying and often dying in isolation. And it's very interesting to watch the different reaction of the two sisters. Martha was obviously psychologically very strong and quite an intellectual. And she remonstrated with Christ and said, look, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And he replied and said that Lazarus would rise again. And she then responded, and they entered into a theological discussion. Obviously a very strong-minded person, because he was standing in the graveyard of her brother who'd just been dead a couple of days. But when he met Mary, she came out and she was weeping her heart out and said exactly what her sister said. If you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But his reaction was totally different. He didn't say anything. He wept. And I think the answer to your question is sometimes we need to weep with those that weep and mourn with those that mourn. And a touch on a shoulder, if you were allowed to do it these days, a hug, and weeping can get through a veil of tears much better than trivial answers and just saying something for the sake of it. Frankly, we don't know what to say. And so we need to be honest about it and keep quiet. This thing is so big, as far as I can see. We've never been there before. And honesty tells me that we're at a loss facing it. So all we can do is to, and I think it's an important thing to do, is to point to this kind of story in the Gospels that points not to our sympathy, but to the nature and the depths of God's sympathy. And what strikes me about this story is that Jesus in that graveyard, as he saw what death had done, the death of Lazarus had done to that little family, he wept in deep sympathy. Now, he was about to raise the man from the dead, but the whole event did what the coronavirus does to some people. It nearly brought those sisters to doubt the love of God. And when the crowd saw Jesus weeping, they said, behold how he loved him, but couldn't he have prevented him from dying? And after that suffering that Jesus allowed them to go through, and that's another great mystery really, he raised Lazarus from the dead. And that points forward, it seems to me, to the resurrection of Jesus himself. So you've got two huge elements confronting us. One, that he understands our suffering. He understands the suffering of others far better than we looking at it do. But secondly, he was raised from the dead, and that gives a hope that goes beyond the grave. And that's the thing I cling on to.
So I guess one of the problems that we have is that we are creatures who only know about the past and the present, and we can't see the future, and therefore there's a crucial part of the bigger picture that we're missing, and that can cause our consternation. Would you agree?
I think that's right. But it seems to me that if we gain confidence in the past, that is in the events, some of which I've just related, and secondly, if in our own personal experience we have encountered God through Christ, that is the kind of added dimension that gives us the confidence to trust him with the uncertainties into the future. You know, one of the things that strikes me, and I mentioned it in the book, is that all of us, especially if and when we were students, we say, look, surely a good and powerful God could have made a world in which this kind of thing didn't happen, in which neither human nature broke down or physical nature broke down. And we argue about these things all night and we never come to a solution. It goes beyond us. And over the years, I've begun to think perhaps we need to ask another question as well. And that is, all of us, whatever our worldview, have to face the brokenness of human nature and of physical nature. It's a mixed picture, and I often call it beauty and bombs, but I might as well call it beauty and the coronavirus. I looked up at the stars the other night and saw Orion Nebula, absolutely glorious against the background of the galaxies. And then I come indoors and look at television and see a hospital with the doctors distraught because they haven't enough equipment to treat the patients that are dying around them. It's a mixed picture. And therefore, the hard question that I feel utterly forced to ask is this, to ask myself, granted that the picture is mixed, is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God that we can trust with it? And that brings me back again, actually, to the past, to the death and resurrection of Jesus. If this really is God, then I can see a window, not a solution, but a window into here is a person that where I can't trust it, I can trust him with it.
John, earlier in our conversation, you talked about the range of reactions that people have to such dilemmas as we're facing today, this terrible crisis. And one of these is that, oh, this is God speaking to us. And there's no end of voices raised today making that point. What do you think of that interpretation of what we're experiencing? And if it's true that God is speaking to us through this in some way, what is he saying?
Well, I am very careful here because there is such a danger. And I'll try and explain what the danger is. You see, people say, look, if you take scripture seriously, the Bible, you will see there that particular plagues were rained down on various nations, and we're told that they are judgments of God. And that is, of course, true. But I notice that those plagues, we have God's direct word for it. But so far as I know, we do not have God's direct word on COVID-19. And therefore, we have to be very careful. But there's a second reason why we have to be careful. Because Jesus himself made it abundantly clear that not all tragedy or catastrophe or disease results from one group of people being worse than others. And there's a very famous incident that Luke describes to us where Jesus was on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and the people pointed out that there had been an absolute tragedy there when Pilate had, with his soldiers, massacred a group of people who were making their sacrifices to God. Now, that's moral evil. But the fascinating thing about that incident was that Jesus then picked up another incident that had happened in Jerusalem. One of the towers in the ancient city, the Tower of Siloam, had collapsed, and it had killed 18 people. Now, that's tinier than the coronavirus, of course, but it's the same principle. It was something that happened. And the reaction that Jesus made to both of those is very important. Do you think that they were worse sinners than everybody else? No, they were not. So we have Christ's word for it, that we cannot just take any event and judge it and say, that is the judgment of God. Now, what I noticed, there are two things I notice about this. When someone, Christian or not, and it's not only Christians say this, alas, say that a particular disaster is caused by God, what's the reaction to that? People don't usually begin to think about God. No, they think about the person making that judgment, and they react very negatively and say, just what right have you to say that this is God's judgment? What right have you? Who do you think you are? Whereas if we take a more nuanced view and point these things out that I've begun to point out, then we might open up the possibility that there's another way of looking at this. You see, in that incident recorded by Luke, Jesus says two things. He says, first, do you think that these people were worse than others? The answer to that is no. But then he said, except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. Now, C.S. Lewis once wrote this: we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a dead world. Now, from that perspective, it seems to me that COVID-19 might well function as a huge loudspeaker. I can see that happening because it reminds us of our vulnerability and our mortality. And it leads us to have interviews like this, asking deep questions about life and God and eternity. And if these events induce any of us to look to the God whom, being honest, we might have ignored for years, and help us to think about the matter of the fact that we are mortal and one day will have to face him, then something good could come out of it, as well as all the pain and evil. Now, I know this is a very inadequate response, Ian, but it seems to me that the idea of asking yourself, what does this raise in my mind? What issues does it raise? Is a far safer way of going than arrogating to oneself the moral high ground that says this is God judging the lot of us.
Well, you say it's an inadequate response. Inadequate was not the word that I had in mind, I have to say. That's a very thought-provoking answer to the question, and I'm sure all who are listening are grateful for it. In the book, you say that in relation to the coronavirus, we need to make sense of it intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. And we've certainly touched on the spiritual dimension quite extensively, but might I ask you just to say a word about what you mean and what you intend to achieve by bringing those three together? What are you asking people to do?
Well, we are complex beings, and we have needs in different directions. It's pretty obvious from the story that I've related about Mary and Martha that Martha was much more intellectually inclined, and her needs were intellectual. She needed to discuss the question of resurrection, and she believed that there would be a resurrection in the last day, but Jesus brought something hugely new into it that gave her a new perspective. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. But Mary was in an emotional state. She was distressed. And so her question, it wasn't so much of responding to her question, but responding to the questioner. And by weeping, Jesus showed his sympathy and his empathy with her, that he understood. And that was the message for her. And of course, in connection with God, there is that spiritual dimension, because the COVID-19 virus and what's happening around the world faces all of us with the question, what happens after death. It raises the spiritual question of, have I got a relationship with God, and what do I need to do about it? Because although thinking of any given individual or group, we're not thinking of a direct judgment of God. The fact is that I and you and everybody else have not kept up God's standard, not kept up our own standards, let alone God's standards. And the question is, on what basis are we going to meet him when we inevitably will, either through being killed on the roads, a flu, the coronavirus, or dying of old age in our beds? That eternity is very real. And therefore, it seems to me that we need to be sensitive enough to realize where people are coming from. And there's no point in engaging in a high-powered intellectual dialogue with someone who is deeply emotionally distressed. But there's no point in weeping with an atheist who says, look, this proves to me there's no God. Have you got any reasons for believing in God? Then you have to answer that. That's what I meant.
Well, there's very deep meaning in what you're saying, and I'm sure that you're whetting the appetite of all who are listening and who have not yet acquired your book. So a practical question on that: where can this book, God and the Coronavirus, be sourced, and what do you hope it will achieve for its readers?
Well, the book is being published by The Good Book Company, and you can find all the details about it on the Good Book Company website. All you have to do is Google that. But it's also simultaneously being published as an ebook and an audio book, and indeed in multiple languages. It's a short book. It costs less than the price of a cup of coffee. And I've really pitched it in the following way. I imagine people sitting with me, having a cup of coffee in a coffee shop, if only we could, in this lockdown situation. And they asked me the question, where is God in a coronavirus world? And the book, short, attempts to put together some of the things we've just discussed, together with other things, in the hope that it will achieve a number of things. First of all, and primary, to bring some kind of glimmer of hope, let me put it modestly like that, glimmer of hope and solace, that they will sense that I sympathize with their queries, whether they're atheists, agnostics, Christians, or people of any other worldview. I'd just like to present something for them to think about, so that they might, and this is my hope, see that actually Christianity, which Europe has ignored and written out of the Constitution, has got something very important to say into this present crisis.
On behalf of everyone who's watching this, can I just say a huge thank you for sharing with us in such a deeply meaningful way. I found it fascinating and insightful, and we're all very grateful.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to the interview.